Chapter 14 of Anne's House of Dreams by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. November Days. The splendor of color which had glowed for weeks along the shores of Four Winds Harbor had faded out into the soft gray blue of late autumnal hills. There came many days when fields and shores were dim with misty rain, or shivering before the breath of a melancholy sea wind. Nights, too, of storm and tempest, when Anne sometimes wakened to pray that no ship might be beating up the grim north shore, for if it were so, not even the great faithful light, whirling through the darkness unafraid, could avail to guide it into safe haven. "In November I sometimes feel as if spring could never come again," she sighed, grieving over the hopeless unsightliness of her frosted and bedraggled flower-pots. The gay little garden of the schoolmaster's bride was rather a forlorn place now, and the Lombardys and birches were under bare poles, as Captain Jim said. But the fir wood behind the little house was forever green and staunch, and even in November and December there came gracious days of sunshine and purple hazes, when the harbor danced and sparkled as blithely as in midsummer, and the gulf was so softly blue and tender that the storm and the wild wind seemed only things of a long past dream. Anne and Gilbert spent many an autumn evening at the lighthouse. It was always a cheery place. Even when the east wind sang in minor and the sea was dead and gray, hints of sunshine seemed to be lurking all about it. Perhaps this was because the first mate always paraded it in panoply of gold. He was so large and effulgent that one hardly missed the sun, and his resounding purrs formed a pleasant accompaniment to the laughter and conversation which went on round Captain Jim's fireplace. Captain Jim and Gilbert had many long discussions and high converse on matters beyond the ken of cat or king. "I like to ponder on all kinds of problems, though I can't solve 'em," said Captain Jim. "My father held that we should never talk of things we couldn't understand. But if we didn't, doctor, the subjects for conversation would be mighty few. I reckon the gods laugh many a time to hear us, but what matters so long as we remember that we're only men and don't take to fancying that we're gods ourselves, really, knowing good and evil. I reckon our powwows won't do us or anyone much harm. So let's have another whack at the whence, why, and whither this evening, doctor." While they whacked, Anne listened or dreamed. Sometimes Leslie went to the lighthouse with them, and she and Anne wandered along the shore in the eerie twilight, or sat on the rocks below the lighthouse until the darkness drove them back to the cheer of the driftwood fire. Then Captain Jim would brew them tea and tell them tales of land and sea and whatsoever might betide the great forgotten world outside. Leslie always seemed to enjoy those lighthouse carousals very much, and bloomed out for the time being into ready wit and beautiful laughter or glowing-eyed silence. There was a certain tang and savor in the conversation when Leslie was present which they missed when she was absent. Even when she did not talk, she seemed to inspire others to brilliancy. Captain Jim told his stories better. Gilbert was quicker in argument and repartee. Anne felt little gushes and trickles of fancy and imagination bubbling to her lips under the influence of Leslie's personality. "That girl was born to be a leader in social and intellectual circles, far away from Four Winds," she said to Gilbert as they walked home one night. "She's just wasted here, wasted." "Weren't you listening to Captain Jim and yours truly the other night when we discussed that subject generally? We came to the comforting conclusion that the Creator probably knew how to run his universe quite as well as we do, and that, after all, there are no such things as wasted lives, saving and excepting when an individual willfully squanders and wastes his own life, which Leslie Moore certainly hasn't done. And some people might think that a Redmond B.A., whom editors were beginning to honor, was wasted as the wife of a struggling country doctor in the rural community of Four Winds." "Gilbert!" "If you had married Roy Gardner now," continued Gilbert mercilessly, "you could have been a leader in social and intellectual circles far away from Four Winds." "Gilbert Blythe!" "You know you were in love with him at one time, Anne." "Gilbert, that's mean. Pisen mean, just like all the men, as Miss Cornelia says. I never was in love with him. I only imagined I was. You know that. You know I'd rather be your wife in our house of dreams and fulfillment than a queen in a palace." Gilbert's answer was not in words. But I'm afraid that both of them forgot poor Leslie speeding her lonely way across the fields to a house that was neither a palace nor the fulfillment of a dream. The moon was rising over the sad, dark sea behind them and transfiguring it. Her light had not yet reached the harbor, the further side of which was shadowy and suggestive, with dim coves and rich glooms and jeweling lights. "How the home light shines out tonight through the dark," said Anne. "That string of them over the harbor looks like a necklace. And what a coruscation there is up at the Glen. Oh, look, Gilbert, there is ours. I'm so glad we left it burning. I hate to come home to a dark house. Our home light, Gilbert. Isn't it lovely to see? Just like one of Earth's many millions of homes, Anne girl. But ours. Ours. Our beacon in a naughty world. When a fellow has a home and a dear little red-haired wife in it, what more need he ask of life?" "Well, he might ask one thing more," whispered Anne happily. "Oh, Gilbert, it seems as if I just couldn't wait for the spring." End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Anne's House of Dreams by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. Christmas at Four Winds. At first, Anne and Gilbert talked of going home to Avonlea for Christmas, but eventually they decided to stay in Four Winds. "I want to spend the first Christmas of our life together in our own home," decreed Anne. So it fell out that Marilla and Mrs. Rachel Lynde and the twins came to Four Winds for Christmas. Marilla had the face of a woman who had circumnavigated the globe. She had never been 60 miles away from home before, and she had never eaten a Christmas dinner anywhere save at Green Gables. Mrs. Rachel had made and brought with her an enormous plum pudding. Nothing could have convinced Mrs. Rachel that a college graduate of the younger generation could make a Christmas plum pudding properly, but she bestowed approval on Anne's house. "Anne's a good housekeeper," she said to Marilla in the spare room the night of their arrival. "I've looked into her bread box and her scrap pail. I always judge a housekeeper by those, that's what. There's nothing in the pail that shouldn't have been thrown away, and no stale pieces in the bread box. Of course, she was trained up with you, but then she went to college afterwards. I notice she's got my tobacco stripe quilt on the bed here, and that big round braided mat of yours before her living room fire. It makes me feel right at home." Anne's first Christmas in her own house was as delightful as she could have wished. The day was fine and bright. The first skin of snow had fallen on Christmas Eve and made the world beautiful. The harbor was still open and glittering. Captain Jim and Miss Cornelia came to dinner. Leslie and Dick had been invited, but Leslie made excuse. They always went to her Uncle Isaac West's for Christmas, she said. She'd rather have it so, Miss Cornelia told Anne. She can't bear taking Dick where there are strangers. Christmas is always a hard time for Leslie. She and her father used to make a lot of it. Miss Cornelia and Mrs. Rachel Lynde did not take a very violent fancy to each other. Two suns hold not their courses in one sphere. But they did not clash at all, for Mrs. Rachel was in the kitchen helping Anne and Marilla with the dinner, and it fell to Gilbert to entertain Captain Jim and Miss Cornelia, or rather to be entertained by them, for a dialogue between those two old friends and antagonists was assuredly never dull. "It's many a year since there was a Christmas dinner here, Mistress Blythe," said Captain Jim. "Miss Russell always went to her friends in town for Christmas. But I was here to the first Christmas dinner that was ever eaten in this house, and the schoolmaster's bride cooked it. That was 60 years ago today, Mistress Blythe, and a day very like this, just enough snow to make the hills white, and the harbor as blue as June. I was only a lad, and I'd never been invited out to dinner before, and I was too shy to eat enough. I've got all over that." "Most men do," said Miss Cornelia, sewing furiously. Miss Cornelia was not going to sit with idle hands, even on Christmas. Babies come without any consideration for holidays, and there was one expected in a poverty-stricken household at Glen St. Mary. Miss Cornelia had sent that household a substantial dinner for its little swarm, and so meant to eat her own with a comfortable conscience. "Well, you know the way to a man's heart is through his stomach, Cornelia," explained Captain Jim. "I believe you, when he has a heart," retorted Miss Cornelia. "I suppose that's why so many women kill themselves cooking, just as poor Amelia Baxter did. She died last Christmas morning, and she said it was the first Christmas since she was married that she didn't have to cook a big 20-plate dinner. It must have been a real pleasant change for her. Well, she's been dead a year, so you'll soon hear of Horace Baxter taking notice." "I heard he was taking notice already," said Captain Jim, winking at Gilbert. "Wasn't he up to your place one Sunday lately, with his funeral blacks on and a boiled collar?" "No, he wasn't. And he needn't come neither. I could have had him long ago when he was fresh. I don't want any second-hand goods, believe me. As for Horace Baxter, he was in financial difficulties a year ago last summer, and he prayed to the Lord for help, and when his wife died and he got her life insurance, he said he believed it was the answer to his prayer. Wasn't that like a man?" "Have you really proof that he said that, Cornelia?" "I have the Methodist minister's word for it, if you call that proof. Robert Baxter told me the same thing, too, but I admit that isn't evidence. Robert Baxter isn't often known to tell the truth." Come, Cornelia. I think he generally tells the truth, but he changes his opinion so often it sometimes sounds as if he didn't." "It sounds like it mighty often, believe me. But trust one man to excuse another. I have no use for Robert Baxter. He turned Methodist just because the Presbyterian choir happened to be singing 'Behold, the Bridegroom Cometh' for a collection piece when him and Margaret walked up the aisle the Sunday after they were married. Served him right for being late. He always insisted the choir did it on purpose to insult him, as if he was of that much importance. But that family always thought they were much bigger potatoes than they really were. His brother Eliphalet imagined the devil was always at his elbow, but I never believed the devil wasted that much time on him." "I don't know," said Captain Jim thoughtfully. "Eliphalet Baxter lived too much alone. Hadn't even a cat or dog to keep him human. When a man is alone he's mighty apt to be with the devil if he ain't with God. He has to choose which company he'll keep, I reckon. If the devil always was at Life Baxter's elbow, it must have been because Life liked to have him there." "Man-like," said Miss Cornelia, and subsided into silence over a complicated arrangement of tucks until Captain Jim deliberately stirred her up again by remarking in a casual way, "I was up to the Methodist church last Sunday morning." "You'd better have been home reading your Bible," was Miss Cornelia's retort. "Come now, Cornelia, I can't see any harm in going to the Methodist church when there's no preaching in your own. I've been a Presbyterian for 76 years, and it isn't likely my theology will hoist anchor at this late day." "It's setting a bad example," said Miss Cornelia grimly. "Besides," continued wicked Captain Jim, "I wanted to hear some good singing. The Methodists have a good choir, and you can't deny, Cornelia, that the singing in our church is awful since the split in the choir." "What if the singing isn't good? They're doing their best, and God sees no difference between the voice of a crow and the voice of a nightingale." Come, Cornelia," said Captain Jim mildly. "I've a better opinion of the Almighty's ear for music than that." "What caused the trouble in our choir?" asked Gilbert, who was suffering from suppressed laughter. "It dates back to the new church 3 years ago," answered Captain Jim. "We had a fearful time over the building of that church. Fell out over the question of a new site. The 2 sites wasn't more'n 200 yards apart, but you'd have thought they was 1,000 by the bitterness of that fight. We was split up into 3 factions. One wanted the east site, and one the south, and one held to the old. It was fought out in bed and at board, and in church and at market. All the old scandals of 3 generations were dragged out of their graves and aired. 3 matches was broken up by it, and the meetings we had to try to settle the question. Cornelia, will you ever forget the one when old Luther Burns got up and made a speech? He stated his opinions forcibly." "Call a spade, Captain. You mean he got red mad and raked them all fore and aft. They deserved it, too, a pack of incapables. But what would you expect of a committee of men? That building committee held 27 meetings, and at the end of the 27th weren't no nearer having a church than when they begun. Not so near, for a fact, for in one fit of hurrying things along they'd gone to work and tore the old church down, so there we were without a church, and no place but the hall to worship in." "The Methodists offered us their church, Cornelia." "The Glen St. Mary church wouldn't have been built to this day," went on Miss Cornelia, ignoring Captain Jim, "if we women hadn't just started in and took charge. We said we meant to have a church, if the men meant to quarrel till doomsday, and we were tired of being a laughingstock for the Methodists. We held 1 meeting and elected a committee and canvassed for subscriptions. We got them, too. When any of the men tried to sass us, we told them they'd tried for 2 years to build a church, and it was our turn now. We shut them up close, believe me, and in 6 months we had our church. Of course, when the men saw we were determined, they stopped fighting and went to work, manlike, as soon as they saw they had to or quit bossing. Oh, women can't preach or be elders, but they can build churches and scare up the money for them." "The Methodists allow women to preach," said Captain Jim. Miss Cornelia glared at him. "I never said the Methodists hadn't common sense, Captain. What I say is, I doubt if they have much religion." "I suppose you're in favor of votes for women, Miss Cornelia," said Gilbert. "I'm not hankering after the vote, believe me," said Miss Cornelia scornfully. "I know what it is to clean up after the men. But some of these days, when the men realize they've got the world into a mess they can't get it out of, they'll be glad to give us the vote and shoulder their troubles over on us. That's their scheme. Oh, it's well that women are patient, believe me." "What about Job?" suggested Captain Jim. "Job? It was such a rare thing to find a patient man that when one was really discovered they were determined he shouldn't be forgotten," retorted Miss Cornelia triumphantly. "Anyhow, the virtue doesn't go with the name. There never was such an impatient man born as old Job Taylor over harbor." "Well, you know, he had a good deal to try him, Cornelia. Even you can't defend his wife. I always remember what old William McAllister said of her at her funeral. 'There's nae doot she was a Christian woman, but she had the deil's own temper.'" "I suppose she was trying," admitted Miss Cornelia reluctantly, "but that didn't justify what Job said when she died. He rode home from the graveyard the day of the funeral with my father. He never said a word till they got near home. Then he heaved a big sigh and said, 'You may not believe it, Stephen, but this is the happiest day of my life.' Wasn't that like a man?" "I suppose poor old Mrs. Job did make life kinder uneasy for him," reflected Captain Jim. "Well, there's such a thing as decency, isn't there? Even if a man is rejoicing in his heart over his wife being dead, he needn't proclaim it to the four winds of heaven. And happy day or not, Job Taylor wasn't long in marrying again, you might notice. His second wife could manage him. She made him walk Spanish, believe me. The first thing she did was to make him hustle round and put up a tombstone to the first Mrs. Job, and she had a place left on it for her own name. She said there'd be nobody to make Job put up a monument to her." "Speaking of Taylors, how is Mrs. Lewis Taylor up at the Glen, doctor?" asked Captain Jim. "She's getting better slowly, but she has to work too hard," replied Gilbert. "Her husband works too hard, raising prize pigs," said Miss Cornelia. "He's noted for his beautiful pigs. He's a heap prouder of his pigs than of his children. But then, to be sure, his pigs are the best pigs possible, while his children don't amount to much. He picked a poor mother for them and starved her while she was bearing and rearing them. His pigs got the cream and his children got the skim milk." "There are times, Cornelia, when I have to agree with you, though it hurts me," said Captain Jim. "That's just exactly the truth about Lewis Taylor. When I see those poor miserable children of his robbed of all children ought to have, it pisons my own bite and sup for days afterwards." Gilbert went out to the kitchen in response to Anne's beckoning. Anne shut the door and gave him a connubial lecture. "Gilbert, you and Captain Jim must stop baiting Miss Cornelia. Oh, I've been listening to you, and I just won't allow it." "Anne, Miss Cornelia's enjoying herself hugely. You know she is." "Well, never mind. You two needn't egg her on like that. Dinner is ready now, and Gilbert, don't let Mrs. Rachel carve the geese. I know she means to offer to do it because she doesn't think you can do it properly. Show her you can." "I ought to be able to. I've been studying ABCD diagrams of carving for the past month," said Gilbert. "Only don't talk to me while I'm doing it, Anne, for if you drive the letters out of my head I'll be in a worse predicament than you were in old geometry days when the teacher changed them." Gilbert carved the geese beautifully. Even Mrs. Rachel had to admit that, and everybody ate of them and enjoyed them. Anne's first Christmas dinner was a great success, and she beamed with housewifely pride. Merry was the feast and long, and when it was over they gathered around the cheer of the red hearth flame, and Captain Jim told them stories until the red sun swung low over Four Winds Harbor and the long blue shadows of the Lombardys fell across the snow in the lane. "I must be getting back to the light," he said finally. "I'll just have time to walk home before sundown. Thank you for a beautiful Christmas, Mistress Blythe. Bring Master Davy down to the light some night before he goes home." "I want to see those stone gods," said Davy with a relish. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Anne's House of Dreams by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. New Year's Eve at the Light. The Green Gables folk went home after Christmas, Marilla under solemn covenant to return for a month in the spring. More snow came before New Year's, and the harbor froze over, but the gulf was still free beyond the white, imprisoned fields. The last day of the old year was one of those bright, cold, dazzling winter days which bombard us with their brilliancy and command our admiration, but never our love. The sky was sharp and blue, the snow diamonds sparkled insistently, the stark trees were bare and shameless, with a kind of brazen beauty. The hills shot assaulting lances of crystal. Even the shadows were sharp and stiff and clear-cut, as no proper shadows should be. Everything that was handsome seemed 10 times handsomer and less attractive in the glaring splendor, and everything that was ugly seemed 10 times uglier, and everything was either handsome or ugly. There was no soft blending or kind obscurity or elusive mistiness in that searching glitter. The only things that held their own individuality were the firs, for the fir is the tree of mystery and shadow, and yields never to the encroachments of crude radiance. But finally the day began to realize that she was growing old. Then a certain pensiveness fell over her beauty, which dimmed yet intensified it. Sharp angles, glittering points, melted away into curves and enticing gleams. The white harbor put on soft grays and pinks, the faraway hills turned amethyst. "The old year is going away beautifully," said Anne. She and Leslie and Gilbert were on their way to the Four Winds Point, having plotted with Captain Jim to watch the New Year in at the Light. The sun had set, and in the southwestern sky hung Venus, glorious and golden, having drawn as near to her earth sister as is possible for her. For the first time Anne and Gilbert saw the shadow cast by that brilliant star of evening, that faint, mysterious shadow, never seen save when there is white snow to reveal it, and then only with averted vision, vanishing when you gaze at it directly. "It's like the spirit of a shadow, isn't it?" whispered Anne. "You can see it so plainly haunting your side when you look ahead, but when you turn and look at it, it's gone." "I have heard that you can see the shadow of Venus only once in a lifetime, and that within a year of seeing it your life's most wonderful gift will come to you," said Leslie. But she spoke rather hardly. Perhaps she thought that even the shadow of Venus could bring her no gift of life. Anne smiled in the soft twilight. She felt quite sure what the mystic shadow promised her. They found Marshall Elliott at the lighthouse. At first Anne felt inclined to resent the intrusion of this long-haired, long-bearded eccentric into the familiar little circle. But Marshall Elliott soon proved his legitimate claim to membership in the household of Joseph. He was a witty, intelligent, well-read man, rivaling Captain Jim himself in the knack of telling a good story. They were all glad when he agreed to watch the old year out with them. Captain Jim's small nephew Joe had come down to spend New Year's with his great uncle, and had fallen asleep on the sofa with the first mate curled up in a huge golden ball at his feet. "Ain't he a dear little man?" said Captain Jim gloatingly. "I do love to watch a little child asleep, Mistress Blythe. It's the most beautiful sight in the world, I reckon. Joe does love to get down here for a night, because I have him sleep with me. At home he has to sleep with the other 2 boys, and he doesn't like it. 'Why can't I sleep with father, Uncle Jim?' says he. 'Everybody in the Bible slept with their fathers.' As for the questions he asks, the minister himself couldn't answer them. They fair swamp me. Uncle Jim, if I wasn't me, who'd I be? And, Uncle Jim, what would happen if God died? He fired them 2 off at me tonight afore he went to sleep. As for his imagination, it sails away from everything. He makes up the most remarkable yarns, and then his mother shuts him up in the closet for telling stories. And he sits down and makes up another one, and has it ready to relate to her when she lets him out. He had one for me when he come down tonight. 'Uncle Jim,' says he, solemn as a tombstone, 'I had a venture in the Glen today.' 'Yes, what was it?' says I, expecting something quite startling, but nowise prepared for what I really got. 'I met a wolf in the street,' says he, 'enormous wolf with a big red mouth and awful long teeth, Uncle Jim.' 'I didn't know there was any wolves up at the Glen,' says I. "Oh, he comed there from far, far away," says Joe, "and I fought he was going to eat me up, Uncle Jim." "Were you scared?" says I. "No, 'cause I had a big gun," says Joe, "and I shot the wolf dead, Uncle Jim, solid dead, and then he went up to heaven and bit God," says he. Well, I was fair staggered, Mistress Blythe. The hours bloomed into mirth around the driftwood fire. Captain Jim told tales, and Marshall Elliott sang old Scotch ballads in a fine tenor voice. Finally Captain Jim took down his old brown fiddle from the wall and began to play. He had a tolerable knack of fiddling, which all appreciated save the first mate, who sprang from the sofa as if he had been shot, emitted a shriek of protest, and fled wildly up the stairs. "Can't cultivate an ear for music in that cat nohow," said Captain Jim. "He won't stay long enough to learn to like it. When we got the organ up at the Glen Church, old Elder Richards bounced up from his seat the minute the organist began to play and scuttled down the aisle and out of the church at the rate of no man's business. It reminded me so strong of the first mate tearing loose as soon as I begun to fiddle that I come near to laughing out loud in church than I ever did before or since." There was something so infectious in the rollicking tunes that Captain Jim played that very soon Marshall Elliott's feet began to twitch. He had been a noted dancer in his youth. Presently he started up and held out his hands to Leslie. Instantly she responded. Round and round the firelit room they circled with a rhythmic grace that was wonderful. Leslie danced like one inspired. The wild, sweet abandon of the music seemed to have entered into and possessed her. Anne watched her in fascinated admiration. She had never seen her like this. All the innate richness and color and charm of her nature seemed to have broken loose and overflowed in crimson cheek and glowing eye and grace of motion. Even the aspect of Marshall Elliott, with his long beard and hair, could not spoil the picture. On the contrary, it seemed to enhance it. Marshall Elliott looked like a Viking of elder days, dancing with one of the blue-eyed, golden-haired daughters of the Northland. "The purtiest dancing I ever saw, and I've seen some in my time," declared Captain Jim, when at last the bow fell from his tired hand. Leslie dropped into her chair laughing, breathless. "I love dancing," she said apart to Anne. "I haven't danced since I was 16, but I love it. The music seems to run through my veins like quicksilver, and I forget everything except the delight of keeping time to it. There isn't any floor beneath me, or walls about me, or roof over me. I'm floating amid the stars." Captain Jim hung his fiddle up in its place, beside a large frame enclosing several banknotes. "Is there anybody else of your acquaintance who can afford to hang his walls with banknotes for pictures?" he asked. "There's 20 $10 notes there, not worth the glass over them. They're old Bank of P.E. Island notes. Had them by me when the bank failed, and I had 'em framed and hung up, partly as a reminder not to put your trust in banks, and partly to give me a real luxurious millionary feeling. Hallo, matey, don't be scared. You can come back now. The music and revelry is over for tonight. The old year has just another hour to stay with us. I've seen 76 New Years come in over that gulf yonder, Mistress Blythe." "You'll see 100, said Marshall Elliott. Captain Jim shook his head. "No, and I don't want to. At least, I think I don't. Death grows friendlier as we grow older. Not that one of us really wants to die, though, Marshall. Tennyson spoke truth when he said that. There's old Mrs. Wallace up at the Glen. She's had heaps of trouble all her life, poor soul, and she's lost almost everyone she cared about. She's always saying that she'll be glad when her time comes, and she doesn't want to sojourn any longer in this vale of tears. But when she takes a sick spell, there's a fuss. Doctors from town and a trained nurse and enough medicine to kill a dog. Life may be a vale of tears, all right, but there are some folks who enjoy weeping, I reckon." They spent the old year's last hour quietly around the fire. A few minutes before 12, Captain Jim rose and opened the door. "We must let the new year in," he said. Outside was a fine blue night. A sparkling ribbon of moonlight garlanded the gulf. Inside the bar, the harbor shone like a pavement of pearl. They stood before the door and waited. Captain Jim with his ripe, full experience, Marshall Elliott in his vigorous but empty middle life, Gilbert and Anne with their precious memories and exquisite hopes, Leslie with her record of starved years and her hopeless future. The clock on the little shelf above the fireplace struck 12. "Welcome, New Year," said Captain Jim, bowing low as the last stroke died away. "I wish you all the best year of your lives, mates. I reckon that whatever the new year brings us will be the best the great captain has for us, and somehow or other we'll all make port in a good harbor." End of chapter 16.